So, how long have you been a beekeeper for?
Well, I started keeping bees in 1987, so I guess that makes about 33 years so far.
How many hives do you have?
Right now, I have 3 hives. I've always just been a hobby beekeeper. I have had as many as 10. I generally, before I moved back to Kansas, I generally tried to run with about 6. I could handle that in my job, my day job,
Yeah.
comfortably enough. Since I've moved here, I've had as many as 6. I have 3 now.
So, was it easier keeping bees where you lived beforehand versus now?
Um, I not necessarily by virtue of where I live, but over time things changed. When I first kept bees, we didn't have there, at least in Connecticut, there were no the primary parasites on bees, uh, varroa mites and tracheal mites. We didn't have any of those in Connecticut, and certainly it's easier to keep bees when you don't have things that kill them over the winter. I didn't when I first started keeping bees. I hardly ever lost colonies over the winter. Um, Actually, but in the last 10 or 15, about the last 15 years, it's been a fairly frequent occurrence. And as a matter of fact, last November, all my colonies died, and I started over again last month.
What drove you to become a beekeeper?
Well, again, I'd always had an interest, and then the opportunity to start something new in a new place and have that hobby with my boys. Then bees are extremely interesting creatures, and so I'm finding. I learn something every year. I've been doing it for a long time, but I'm always still learning something, and I find it is different in various stages. When I started keeping bees, there were none of these parasites. We were devastated with varroa mites and tracheal mites these days, and now since I moved to Kansas, I have a new experience. We didn't have any small hive beetles in Connecticut, but there's always something that's a pest that you have to deal with in your hives. But then their biology is quite different from what we usually are used to with mammals and birds, for example. It's just a fascinating thing. They're very fascinating creatures.
Interesting. What were the parasites you were saying?
Well, the primary parasites on honeybees are varroa mites.
And what do they do to
Well,
honeybees?
you can actually see them. They're very tiny, but you can see them. Uh, they they'll get on the honeybee. They'll actually get in the brood too, and inside the what's amounts to the cocoon, and suck on the juices of the bees, weaken them, and damage them that way. But maybe the most importantly is they're also a vector for various other diseases, viruses that affect the bees. So they're a real pest. Interestingly, they're their natural host is a different species of honeybee from Asia uh, that's able to live. They have been able to accommodate one another, but the bees that we normally keep in the U.S. most of them are Italian honeybees, and they don't do well with varroa mites. The other one is tracheal mites, and they're so tiny that you can't see them without a microscope, but they get inside the wind passages. If you can imagine a creature that gets inside the trachea of a honeybee, that would be a very tiny creature, but that's one that also wreaks a lot of damage.
Okay. How do bees help with pollination?
Well, there are many different kinds of bees and other kinds of insects, and even birds and bats that pollinate. But honeybees, live in colonies that have a massive number of bees in there. There might be as many as 40 to 60,000 bees in a healthy colony during the summertime, and so they can do a lot of pollinating. Um, there's other bees, mason bees, for example, are fairly common around here, and they're more efficient pollinators on a one-on-one basis, but they're fairly solitary. They're not in a hive. So if a farmer uh, wants to have his crop pollinated, and you can move a hive of 50,000 bees there, they can get a lot of pollination done. Probably the biggest single um, crop that's pollinated by bees are the almonds in California. Uh, a few years ago I read that $15 billion worth of agriculture in this country is dependent on honeybee pollination. Just more recently I was reading that the California almond crop by itself is $7.6 billion. So that's a lot of agriculture that is completely dependent on honeybee pollination. Out here where we live in Kansas, most of the crops are like wheat and corn and sorghum, things like that are wind pollinated, grasses, and grasses are normally wind pollinated, so they're not as dependent on the bee pollination or insect pollination as in various other parts of the country. But even so, it is still very important here.
Do you think bees are important to?
Absolutely, certainly. There are so many things that we're accustomed to, just taking for granted in our environment. One of the things I would point out also, by the way, is that we are so accustomed to having honeybees around. Honeybees are not native to North America. The most common bee that we use for beekeeping, the Italian bee, didn't come to the U.S. until 1859. The earliest honeybee to this country, the German black bee, it came with the early colonists. So it's not that there weren't any fruits or nuts, but the fruit and nut production was very minimal just before European colonists came and brought the bees with them. So many things that we just take for granted in our environment are because we have increased the pollination prospects by having honeybees in our environment.
Oh, I didn't know that. Cool. Anything else you'd like to share or let the audience know about?
Well, my wife says that I can talk for hours about bees and beekeeping. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that people would be interested in. There's bits of trivia that people always like trivia. Did you have any idea how much honey a single bee might make in its lifetime?
Oh gosh, I have no idea how much.
Well, just make a guess, just so that we can have something to work with here.
5 pounds.
How about 1/12 of a teaspoon?
That's a little.
That's the lifetime production of one worker bee.
How long do bees live for?
Well, that's a good question. A queen bee can live for 4 or 5 years. Normally, they don't stay effective that long, and so most beekeepers will replace their queens maybe every couple of years. But a worker bee, actually, before I answer that question, we need to get into a little bit about their life cycle. So when a bee, in fact, we'll back up even a little bit further. There are, like most anything else, there's males and there's females. But what you don't maybe realize is that the queen bee is a female, obviously, and all the workers are females. And the male bees are called drones. And you can tell a difference in the drone. They're a little bit bigger, and they don't have stingers. So when a bee hatches, when a worker bee hatches out, she starts out, her first job is as a nurse bee, and then she graduates to maybe a guard status or cleaning out, housekeeper and that kind of thing. But their last phase of their life is as a forager. Well, once they're a forager, they are working constantly, flying, and their wings wear out. So in the summertime when they're working, the life span of a honeybee is only around 5 or 6 weeks.
Wow.
Because their wings wear out and they die in the field. Now, when winter comes, in our climate, the bees, they'll stay in the hive mostly, and they'll cluster. They don't hibernate. People ask if they hibernate. They don't hibernate, but they do form a cluster, and the metabolism keeps the cluster warm, and that's how they stay warm. The workers work in and out of the cluster, keeping the queen in the middle to keep her warm.
Okay.
And so those worker bees that make it to the winter, they'll survive all winter long and be ready to start their housekeeping duties, attending the brood and attending the queen and things like that in the spring. Now, interesting, people may think, well, boy, the drones have a good idea. All they have to do is eat and mate. But the fact of the matter is, you can come out here in, say, October, November, as the winter's coming along, and you'll see that the workers are throwing the drones out of the hive, and you'll see that there's dead drone bees around. Since they don't contribute anything for the stores, then the workers get rid of them. And then, of course, new ones will hatch out in the spring.
Wow, I didn't know any of that. That's cool.
A screen bottom board. So I'll set the bottom board like this and then put a screened bottom board on top here. So the bees actually come in this way. What I can do with this back here is I can put in a piece of white plastic thing, and the droppings that come down there, then I can monitor what's going on in the hive by what's, if I can see if there's mites down there or when the bees are pulling wax off. So anyway, you see this is a deep super here.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so I used the deep supers for brood chambers. And then this is a medium super here. And when the bees have filled up the brood chambers, then this is at least this is the honey that I get to keep. And here's what a frame looks like. This frame here's actually got some honey in it.
Oh, cool.
But you can see what these cells look like here. This is, these are what I got. These I got out of the, when the hives died. I froze these over the winter actually. And you can see the bees lay their eggs. The queen lays her eggs in here, and then these, some of these will become capped over with larvae, and then they use the same cells for storing honey in.
Oh, neat.
So this is, what I'm going to do is use these for when I built up the other ones. Now some people, I normally, let me see, do I have an example here? I normally use a wax foundation sheet for the bees to get started. Empty honey super looks like.
So the bees make all the little triangles.
Yeah.
Not
I
triangles, but-
actually, let me think. I have little sheets of wax. Let me see if I got one. And then the bees draw that out into the kind of the honeycomb that you just saw here, white. The reason this is dark like this is because the queen has been laying eggs in here, and so all this dark is the proteins. Now that, some people, instead of using wax to start it with, they'll use a plastic foundation.
Oh, okay. So
And then
this
the
is
bees-
a plastic
That's
backing?
plastic, yeah.
Okay.